Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for this invitation to come to Cornell. I always welcome the chance to come and visit. At the Maxwell School, my colleagues and I talk about public administration, but I feel like so often my real passion is to talk about nutrition and food assistance and food security. And in fact, I do spend a fair amount of time working on those issues as well, especially with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If anybody is tweeting, it's from here, it's hashtag IP50 or at Cornell CALS. And I'm saying that in part because when you see me doing this later, I'm tweeting, I'm not emailing. Let me join Sarah in saying happy International Women's Day. It's a very special day because it's a day to honor women worldwide, but it's also a day for us to recall the challenges that women face around the world, and to remind ourselves that it's our responsibility to work on helping women overcome those challenges throughout the world. The yellow flowers that Sarah just moved are wonderful to be here to welcome us. When I worked in Rome on International Women's Day, all the women were presented yellow flowers, mimosas they called them, as soon as we walked in the door. And it was a really nice reminder of the day. I learned when I was at USDA some years ago that it was important for us, no matter what kind of programming we were doing and no matter what kind of operations we were running, a basic tenet of development, and that is that we have to understand the needs of the people who we're trying to serve. We did that domestically when we worked on, for instance, changing the food coupons to electronic benefit transfer. When we put ourselves, and I put myself in the position of a WIC mother, and then said, what's wrong with this picture? We're giving away free formula. At the same time, we're telling me the right thing to do is to breastfeed my baby. What can we do differently? And we created the breastfeeding package. Food package for breastfeeding moms. And the same kind of thought process is what I tried to bring to WFP. And there it was a bit different, where we established what our mission was. Our mission was to end hunger. And if our mission was to end hunger, then who actually really is doing that in the family? And the answer in every family in the world was, well, the women are doing that. The women are the cooks. In virtually every family in the developing world. And they're not only the cooks, but doing everything else involved in this process as well. And so we very much refocused our work around women, but found that at the same time we had to find ways in which to hear from women, because they weren't often in leadership roles, and we tried to create those as well. And once I moved more into agriculture, I learned that this was even a bigger challenge, to be able to listen to the voices of women who were so many of the farmers all around the world. And from my own perspective, this started on my very first trip, I think in 1991, to Mozambique and to Malawi, when I wanted to bring home a souvenir of my trip, and I wanted to bring something that I saw. And so after rejecting all sorts of other items, what I came up with was a batik wall hanging of women in the field, because that's what I saw. And I ended up with a collection of women, not only wall hangings, but figurines, a Peruvian woman I brought with me today. And I'm happy to say, in a small commercial, that there's a new museum in between Cortland and Homer, New York, called the Central New York Living History Museum. And I have about 100 of my women at work on display in that place. So if you're ever in that neighborhood and have a chance to look at it, I can tell you that those women have inspired me in many ways, because when I wonder on how a day is going and how well or badly it is going, I look at them and they remind me, even though they're only figurines and pictures, of the millions of women around the world for whom I hope my policy work can have some positive benefit. We're talking today about feminization of agriculture, and it's using the word even is as if it's kind of an ongoing process, and maybe some of the other speakers will talk about how it is, but from how it is an ongoing process. But from my perspective, it's something that's existed perhaps as long as agriculture has existed, but we have to be very careful that we understand, again, when we're thinking about agriculture, what the roles of women are, what the roles of men are, and if we're trying to either create policy or impact on systems that attempt to support farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, then it's absolutely crucial that we think about this every day, all the time, with a gender lens. I remember, for instance, seeing women in Latin America who were tending their cows while they were working in the field. And if they were lucky enough to have one cow, they would bring her with them as they worked in the fields. They'd milk her first, bring her to the field, work all day in the fields with the little children running around, then bring the cow and the children back home and milk the cow again. Each time the woman would bring the milk down to the co-op. But once a month when it was time to get the money for the cow, guess who went to get the money? And her husband went to get the money because it was his cow. And again, a reminder to me early on that we have to pay attention not only to the work that women do, but even issues, especially issues of ownership, whether it's animals or land or bank accounts or available credit, and that all of those are critical if again, we want to try to impact on the lives of women who are taking so much taking on so much work in the farms. I had the opportunity at the Gates Foundation, and Ellen McCullough is here, and if you don't know her, you should meet her. She's a second year working on her PhD here. But we worked together there, and part of my job was to try to bring a gender lens to the foundation as it was beginning its work in agriculture. And this got started when I spoke one time, and the new head of agriculture heard me speak, and I had about 2 minutes to respond to his speech, and I said, if you don't pay attention to the roles of women in agriculture, you're going to be doing the same thing that everybody else has done in agriculture development. You're going to be wasting your money. You'll just waste a lot more money faster than anyone else. And they took it to heart and asked me to come and help them. And I would refer you to my website at the Maxwell School to show you one of the things that we created, which was essentially a document about why it's important to think about gender and how you go about doing that. We even created a checklist for the program officers to walk through thinking about women. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a Canadian NGO that runs rural radios, and they were using radios for extension purposes. So there would be a program set up, for instance, in one place I visited in rural Ghana, where the people in the community had decided they would like to have tomatoes. They would like to learn how to grow tomatoes. They thought it would be helpful for from a nutrition perspective, helpful for sales. They were not indigenous to that area. So there was going to be a once a week, half-hour program on each stage of tomato growing. And of course, the women were the ones that were going to be growing the tomatoes. So everything was set, all the programming was set, they checked, they knew everybody had a radio, they organized these nice little programs, they had somebody write them and read them out for the radio. But there was one really important thing that had to be done before they could do this. They had to survey the women and the men in the community to find out when everyone listened to the radio. When do the women listen to the radio? When do the men listen to the radio? And it wasn't enough to say, okay, women listen to the radio at a certain time of the day, let's put it on that day. Because if in fact that time was the same time as the man of the house listened to the radio, then who controlled the dial? So that was just one example of many, but when we're involved in these kind of issues of trying to support women farmers, these are the kind of things that we had to try to learn. But of course, basically what we know from the very beginning, and what IFPRI tells us in a lot of detail, is that first of all, educated farmers are more productive than uneducated farmers. Women farmers are more likely to follow the practices of successful women farmers. So if there are a lot of women in agriculture, it makes a whole lot of sense that certainly some, if not all, should be better educated, in which case they would be more productive. We've also learned from them and from FAO that if women do have the same inputs as men, whether it's fertilizer, credit, or anything else, then they're also going to increase their production, and that's going to significantly make a difference in their household and in their community. But again, most importantly, as I said before, we've learned that if women are educated, that will make a huge difference, and I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the new things about agriculture development lately, I'm proud to say, is that the developing world has rediscovered the importance of investing in supporting the needs of poor farmers around the world. Again, I will go back to the Gates Foundation and give them some credit for this, because they said, look, it doesn't matter how much money we put into this process, unless governments go back to the table and put agriculture development in their portfolios, we're going to be nowhere. And they funded the Chicago Council of Global Affairs in 2008 to try to influence then the McCain and Obama campaigns about the importance of agriculture development. And after President Obama won, in his inaugural, he said to poor people in poor countries, we want to help your farms to flourish. Somebody at FAO said to me, well, what's the difference? We've been talking about agriculture development for a long time. And how is this going to impact on women? And I said, well, there's two differences. One is now the developing world is going to put more attention on it. And in fact, going from in the 80s of something like 25% of their development resources, agriculture, down to 4% in 2006. Now that's climbed back up again, starting to climb up again, in part because of the US leadership, also because the G8 and the G20 said that this should be done. The Secretary of State created a 7-point plan for food security, which then became the Feed the Future initiative of USAID. Also the USAID has put in specific marks about how to measure how involved the programs have kept women, and how they have listened to women and included women in the policymaking process as well as the implementation. So I said at FAO, you know, there's going to be two differences. One difference is going to be more resources, and the other difference is hopefully, as we're rediscovering the importance of agriculture development, we're going to discover, maybe for the first time, that women are the predominance of people working in the agricultural field, and that we actually have to listen and provide inputs that are essentially based around gender needs, interests, and work. And at the same time, we have to be sure to do that and not marginalize women or not make them so successful, as we've seen in some communities, that then the men decide that's something that's better for them to do. I learned about some of these issues firsthand, but I leave it to our panelists to go into more detail in terms of background on each of these. But I'd like to leave you with the announcement that the WFP USA is making today, because I was really proud I was really proud to have won the World Food Prize. When I did, I asked the prize to give the money to the WFP USA for use for a trust fund for girls' education, because I believed and still believe that if there was one critical thing that we could do in this world, it would be sure that all girls had at least a basic education. And so today they are announcing that we're giving a grant of $19,200. These are all small grants to small NGOs, to the Afghan Friends Network. That will support 597 women and girls who are learning math, science, and English in grades 4 through 12, as well as a women's literacy and vocational program, and 17 university scholarships. And we're also providing, thank you. Thank you. And they're also announcing a $20,000 grant from the fund for a project called the Girls Education Collaborative, which is in the Katenga village in Tanzania. And this is to build dormitories for a secondary school for girls, which hopefully will be able to accommodate 100 students in 2014. There's no question that as we are looking at a world that needs considerably more food grown in order to be able to meet the needs of a growing population and a population that's better off, that's looking for more varieties of more expensive food, that we have to take advantage in a good way of every possible effort to be able to grow this food. And so for all of us collectively in every community to not pay attention to the roles and needs of women and men in agriculture, especially in food secure areas, we're doing ourselves a great disservice. And to the extent that we can go out of our way to find ways to support women farmers, women entrepreneurs, women who are supporting other farmers, we will have been able to expand greatly on their opportunities and ultimately on opportunities for the whole world. Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce the panel. The program will be that each of us will speak for 15 minutes and then ask ourselves a few questions and then open to the audience for questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Shelley Feldman. She is the Director of Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of Development Sociology here at Cornell. She's worked in South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh, for many decades, and you couldn't possibly, for many decades, for one or two maybe, and has contributed a significant body of work on rural and agrarian change, land grabbing, as well as women's labor, shame and honor, and relations of social reproduction. Her current research focuses on militarization and social insecurity centered on two projects in Bangladesh. And it is a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Feldman.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me. It's quite a pleasure to be here. I have been tasked, I guess, with providing a sort of general sense of some of the concepts that animate how we think about feminization of agriculture. I think we all assume we know what we're talking about, and I guess the question is, do we? Or what are we talking about? How differently are we talking about it? And Stefan, if you're going to put that stuff up, I'd like that, just the one. Oh, do I do that? Okay. Sure. Is that better? Great, thanks. When we think, well, first of all, I think I might have to start by saying this is really déjà vu. I mean, part of this discussion is something that's happened in the 70s and the 80s, and like, yes, it's International Women's Day, yes, we should applaud, yes, we should be pleased and proud, but on the other hand, what have we accomplished? And I think it's important to be humbled by how little we've really accomplished, in the sense that we're raising the similar issues, or the same issue in some cases, that we've raised early on. And I'm going to share with you some data from the 1970s, just to give you a hint at how this discussion was very well seated in FAO, in ILO, in all the major agencies. And so let me just start by saying there are three different ways to think about feminization, or the ways in which many people think about it. The first is the proportion of women of the entire labor force that's in agriculture, right? So the division between ag and non-ag labor. And a lot of the discussion is if we can get more women in agriculture, we're doing okay. And a lot of the statistics come out basically measuring that. The second is the proportion of women of the labor force in agriculture. And in that case, it's been increasing. As agriculture has declined in significance in response to structural adjustment requirements, to international demands on people's countries' allocation of resources. The value of agriculture has declined in its social sensibilities and in its economic performance. And so what you have is that more women are in agriculture doing a variety of tasks. What are we thinking when we say agriculture? Another key term. Are we thinking of field crop production, or are we thinking of, I think Catherine's nice example of somebody, in the field with the cows and with the kids? Is that valued 3 times labor, or is that 1 labor allocation, or none, because all of it's not valued? Okay, so we think about work, and how many times do you ask people? I mean, my mother's generation, you'd ask, do you work? And they say, no, I'm just a housewife. And that word just was a very big term. What does it mean in agriculture? Well, if we put up the next slide, and I'm supposed to know how to do this. Do I know how to do this? I press the green button. This is a chart. It'll be 82 countries. Oh, these are the definitions. So one is the increase in the percentage of women who are economically active in rural areas of the total female population. The second is an increase in the percentage of women in agricultural labor force relative to men, either because more women are working and or because fewer men are working in agriculture. And so the fewer men is pretty obvious in a certain sense. Migration, out-migration, labor migration has meant that there are more female-headed households. In the 70s, they were probably female-headed, less because of migration, and in a certain sense, more because women were abandoned or their spouses died. But now female-headed households are much more common, and so they're part of the everyday parlance that we think about when we think about feminization. The third is, and I'll end with this, is actually when we say feminization, what are we talking about in terms of feminizing labor? That is low-end, insecure, precarious, low-paid labor. Now that's feminization as an adjective, not as a noun to replace women. So if we think about feminization as a social process that reallocates the organization of labor, we're thinking of something rather different than, are we looking at women? Are we adding women? Are we including women? And I think many of us think about gender as an academic word for women. We don't think about gender as actually the multiplicity of roles that different people play in relation to maybe their biological sex, which is itself another question of how guaranteed that is. But let me go to the next one. Did I just press that green button down? I'm sorry, Stefan. I'm really ignorant. There's only one more. This is a chart based on, as you can see, from 1970 data. And what it says here really is that the unpaid labor, the unremunerated labor of women in agriculture is the black bars, and how much of that is added to the total allocation of labor. This was 1970 ILO data. Okay, important because it says we've been thinking about this for a long time. And we're still thinking in these terms, right? So much of the work there is more than double or triple or quadruple some of the labor that we count as work. Okay, so a couple of things about this is only to say that what is constituting that extra bit, the black bit, right? We know the lighter bit is about women who work and get paid in agriculture or who are marked as owning and operating farms. Okay? If we open that up a little bit, or a lot, we have to ask ourselves, what is the social context in which this is happening? What else is going on in the countryside? What might have been different earlier on, and what's possible now? What does neoliberal reform and structural adjustment do to transform the rural economy in ways that don't look like this romanticized past of a self-sustained farm household? Okay, so one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is what kinds of opportunities are there with the new reforms getting into place, and where are women central? Well, one of the places they're central, particularly in Latin America, is their role in processing and packaging. And if you imagine the amount of work in flowers, if you imagine the amount of work in bananas, if you imagine the amount of work in anything that's for export, we're really talking about a major rural aspect of the economy, or rural part of the economy, in which women are very central. They're easy to hire, they're cheap, they don't complain about part-time or precarious work, informal work, and so they tend to dominate in that field. Okay. Is that what we mean by feminization of agriculture? I think when I was first asked, I said, okay, we're talking about farms, right? And so it's really important to think about what kinds of activities are included under that. With the expansion of microcredit or indebtedness, we might want to say that women are now in micro-enterprises that are linked to agriculture, where they didn't have this opportunity in the 70s. In other words, against that, they didn't have opportunities in the 70s the way they do now. So they're increasing in that regard. They're also increasing as we corporatize and industrialize agriculture. They're also increasing as wage laborers. So they tend to be more counted if they're wage laborers, but they're less counted if they're working part-time or on a seasonal basis. And one of the problems with these definitions is that they really attend to the ways in which the data were collected. If I ask you if you worked and you're a part of a labor survey, the chances are if you're part-time, you're not counted. They tend to count full-time work. And if you're part-time and really seasonal or informal, you're usually not counted. So you might be counted if you're formally a part-time worker. In other words, if you work at Walmart and you work 19.2 hours, you might be counted. But if you work on an as-need basis, you probably aren't counted. Or you're not counted as workers when you work for Christmas, just to get the season started. So at a certain point, it's really important to think about the ways in which the question was asked, who collected the evidence, and the differences between agricultural surveys and labor surveys. And if you put them together, you'll see a kind of tension between them because the figures are really different. And it's usually the agricultural surveys that are much stronger in representing women because they're focused on the farm unit or the rural economy, whereas labor surveys tend to not realize the differentiation of the allocation of labor and labor time. So the other question, the other issue I want to talk about is actually taking seriously feminization. But feminization meaning the relation between men and women and the conditions that enable its reproducibility, the reproducibility of the farm household. If you had to value the labor of women in the farm household and then reproduce it, could you do it without understanding women's involvement in agriculture? Is it possible to think about being able to make that farm over and over again or change as it's necessary without recognizing the labor of women? Who would take care of the cows in Catherine's example? Who would worry about the kids while something else had to be done? So if you think about the relationship of feminization to the reproduction of the household, of the working unit, of the family unit, I think you end up getting a very different sensibility about what women in agriculture is about, because you'll need to think about them and include them. Now, I want to just make two other points here. One is that if we think about labor allocation as opposed to work, we open up a space to think differently about who's doing what and how things are done, as opposed to just measuring how many women are doing X, Y, and Z. And it's much more complicated than just the allocation of the time allocated to one or another thing. Time use studies tend to make the distinction between what your major occupation is or what your major time allocation is, and not count more than one activity at the same time. This becomes central in terms of agriculture, for women's role in agriculture, if you want to think about how you are able to reimagine a production unit without or with women. Let me just turn now to the point of feminization. I would make an argument, and I think it's important that we do, and not limit it to women, to ask what it is about women's so-called roles in agriculture that keeps them at below reproducible wages. In other words, you don't make enough to sustain yourself. And precisely because of that, women are doing this in addition to the low wages that their husbands are getting. And when I say that, what I'm signaling is that men's wages are really being feminized. So it's not about women being in those roles, it's about men's wages being feminized. And I think I said it quite explicitly before: low wages, casual work, precarious labor. We use those terms all the time. We don't think about it as being a feminization, but in fact, if you want to use that language, I don't particularly use it, but if you want to use the language of feminization, you really need to think about what the conditions of that work are. The conditions are. What kinds of conditions enable women or mark women as the appropriate labor force for agribusiness, for example, or for large-scale industrial producers? the old definition was women are docile, they won't organize, that's why they fill the factories of export production. I think it's the same thing in agriculture, and increasingly with the industrialization of agriculture, what you're finding is that women are easier to manage. So they undoubtedly are more visibly in the labor force. But I think Catherine's initial point was really critical, that women have always been in agriculture. They've just been invisibilized. They continue to be invisibilized. And to limit our discussion of feminization to how many women or what proportion of women are involved in agriculture, I think forces us to reproduce the same thing we have in the 70s. So we can say, oh, let's look at what women do. We'll add that little bit of time or that little bit of investment. But it won't really change how we understand agricultural production as dependent on labor, not on working people. We may want to ask under what circumstances is migration greater for men so that there are more female-headed households, but those aren't the only place that women are working. We might want to ask what are the conditions or interventions that were made from the 70s to the present that transform gender relations. I mean, I remember, and just a quick story because I don't know how much more time I have, I remember when they first introduced rice mills in Bangladesh. One of the interesting things is rice milling was women's work. It was home-based production, and if you were very poor, somebody invited you to your house who had a little bit of money where you can get some extra income, often in kind. Rice mills came in. Who got the jobs? They were put in factories, and men got the jobs because women couldn't work machinery. So the division of labor was changed, not because we were attentive to actual production on the ground, but how we changed it. So while I'm quite sensitive to thinking that it's good that governments are putting money back into agriculture and considering it, and I think that's not unimportant, a complement to that is that they took it out of agriculture for the same reasons that the pressure on them to meet other kinds of structural adjustment requirements meant that they removed resources from agriculture. When they brought in a rice mill, who told them where to put it? This was part of international aid. So I think the aid regime very often does things that make presumptions about what rural populations are like, or populations in the third world are like, or the global south are like, and they make assumptions about that and therefore make interventions that coincide with what they think is happening, when in fact it's much more complicated than they usually come in on. And so if feminization is a process, I think we're part of the process. It's not we're looking at somebody else in the South and saying, you have to catch up to us. You have to respond to the ways in which we're now encouraging you to think about production. In fact, what you have to do is ask what are the kinds of practices that have existed for a long time and how have interventions challenged those practices? Sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a negative way. I mean, sometimes when you say, and Bangladesh is a fantastic example for this, oh, in Bangladesh, how could you manage in a Muslim country? I mean, there's such a strict division of labor. I spent my early years in the countryside. I mean, it was not such a strict division of labor on the ground. The labor force statistics show 4% of women were working. I mean, trust me, that didn't touch it. Okay, who those 4% were the middle-class women who had a few jobs in the urban areas, basically professors, because it was one of the few areas that women were notably participatory. They weren't in the ministries, and they weren't surely in a private sector that didn't exist. So in effect, what we're saying is that if we're thinking about feminization of agriculture, we need to think about the relations on the ground and the conditions of work. It's not about a proportion of women in the labor market or a proportion of women in agriculture. And it's also about opening up agriculture to move from field agriculture to aquaculture, to food processing, food packaging. These are very much part of the contemporary. That's very different than it was in this period. So this would be even enhanced significantly if we add these dimensions. So we need to be careful about how our definitions shape our data, and our data shape how we think. And it's a kind of a recursive sensibility. Our data shape the way we think, and then we reproduce the same thing, so we're back in the 1970s. So I don't think we're back in the 1970s. Actually, I think we need to be attentive to the kinds of historical conditions that make for significant changes in the opportunity structures that people have, in the adaptive strategies that households and women make, in the kinds of conditions and constraints that limit some women, forced migration or even migration for employment, that transform households. But these are social processes. They're not limited to the household or to the narrow sense of what women versus men do. So I think I'd actually close there. I can answer a ton of questions later on, but I just hope this sort of broad scape of rethinking some of the concepts that we use and what assumptions we make are at least more explicit for some of the conversation that'll follow. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. Invisibilize, that's a great word for our further discussion later. Next panelist today is Dr. Pilar Parra, who is Research Associate and Senior Lecturer at the Division of Nutritional Sciences and in the Latino Studies program, also at Cornell. Through her research, Pilar examines the role of immigration, acculturation, and poverty in the health status of minority populations. Her work in developing countries focuses on the implementation of primary health services through programs based on local resources and knowledge and active participation of community members, with special attention given to women's roles. She has been awarded grants from the National Institute for Mental Health, USDA, the Social Science Research Council, and she's published on health-related issues. Dr. Parra.
Yes, I would like to have it. It's just for the camera. It's just like in the TV, so TV program. So I should put it here, no? Almost journalist here. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here, and it's an honor to participate in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the international programs at Cornell, and to be part of this distinguished panel. And I want to welcome again our moderator, Bertini, recipient of the World Food Prize. I also want to thank Ronnie Kaufman, Director of International Programs, for his outstanding leadership through these years, and through all this time, the support of our team. Especially, I want to also thank Sarah for her hard work. The question I started when I started to think on this talk was, what factors, what forces have set in motion in recent times this feminization of agriculture? And I put feminization Stefan? Okay, yeah, that's what, okay, good. So, feminization of agriculture, because really what we are talking is just a recent trend of the increment, the number of women working in agriculture. And I'm just so happy to hear Catherine and Shelley talk before me, because it really set up the other aspect of it that I want to discuss, which is context matters. When you look all over the world in many nations and in many regions on the same nation, you will find different circumstances and how and why women incorporate to the agricultural work. So context matters because shapes the experience and the outcomes, and we can think, and I will go briefly over globalization and new markets, international migration, climate change, yes, and AIDS, among others. We can go further. So again, women have been always involved in agriculture, but the issue of their importance and contributions has brought to our attention in the 60s. One seminal work was Bostrup in 1970 in her book, Women's Role in Economic Development, and actually in the work of Shelley too. The main example was African women, who to this day generates between 60 to 70% of the food consumed in their countries. However, in the last 2-3 decades, a noticeable proportion of women have become agricultural laborers worldwide, for hire or in their own farm. Since the 1990s, as the agricultural force declined, the proportion of women working in agriculture increased. In Asian and African countries, half of the labor force in agriculture are women. And although I agreed with Shelley totally that data collection has its limitations, at least gives us some framework and opens the question that how we improve data collection in our research. As we examine this new trend, we will keep in mind the fact that although African women have been involved in agriculture for a long time, actually for a very, very long time, it has not always been transformed into her direct benefit. Mostly women's agricultural work is reduced to subsistence, household consumption, and several barriers persist to their full social and economic advancement and well-being. Context matters. The impacts of globalization. Women's increased involvement in agriculture can be framed with neoliberal policies in the 1980s and an increasing global economy. The neoliberal policies included import liberalization of labor, land, and capital markets. In developing countries, traditional low-value export crops, for example, coffee, sugar, were substituted for labor-intense, high-value crops, vegetables, fruits, and flowers, which opened wage jobs in rural areas. Women started to work in fieldwork, processing, and packing in the growing large-scale production of non-traditional, high-value agricultural exports. Women have been welcomed into this sector due to the labor-intensive tasks and lower wages than men. And I will like to rephrase that, highlight that, and lower wages than men. The temporal availability of these jobs benefits women as independent wage earners, but as temporal seasonal workers do not qualify for social benefits, reduced to repetitive tasks, they lack the opportunity for skill development and possible higher paid jobs. Women make up a large proportion in the vegetable, fruit, and flower businesses and agribusinesses labor force. In Chile, fruit production, 50% of temporary jobs are occupied by women. In the vegetable industry in Sinaloa, Mexico, 90% of packing jobs are held by women. In Brazil, 65% of workers in the vineyards are women. In Kenya, about 75% of packing, labeling, and coding of produce is done by women. Women, often single, also increasingly are becoming temporal migrants traveling to the work sites, and with the exception of the flower industry, women do not hold the availability of permanent jobs. But her domestic workloads have not diminished and still are responsible to feed the families, care of the children, and care of the ill family members. And I talk about the wage, incorporation of women to wage paid jobs in agriculture. Let me talk briefly about the smallholder agriculture, because then we talk about farms and then we talk about people just working for a wage. As men and other family members take off farm employment because of all these structural changes, women are taking more responsibilities in agricultural farming as principal farmer or as unremunerated family worker, which, by the way, most of the time has been that way. Women in these circumstances face managing decisions of agricultural production, engage in work her husband used to perform, or supervise hired workers and finances, which is a push for her in the right direction. Women in small holdings, to ensure the viability of their land, are changing traditional crops for cash crops to take advantage of opportunities in commercial agriculture. But in low productivity lands, due to lack of rain, land erosion, and limited access to inputs, subsistence agriculture is increasingly unviable. Furthermore, in many regions of the world, women as landowners or unremunerated family workers are shouldering full responsibility of their household survival due to the migration of males or the impact of AIDS in some regions of Africa, mostly. Women's work time increment in agriculture has not changed their work time within their households. And this chart shows how the proportion of women in working in the areas changed within the same country, right? So I was in Maharashtra recently with the IP programs, and wherever I went, I see women in the fields. One of the pictures is a recent trip to India in that state. Women are coming back from the fields or going to the fields, and you can see this, the tool, the agricultural tool, which is called seal, you know, one cut, in their hands. In Latin America also there are striking changes. So not in all regions of the world women have a direct work in agriculture. although some of the work that they do is not accounted for, as already Shelley was expanded on that. So we know migration is another, talking about matter context, as we know migration is a global phenomenon. Mostly when we think on migration trends, we focus on south-north. But also large sectors of populations go from poor to median income countries or from poor to poor countries, given for wars and things like that. Like in the case of Central America, Costa Rica received migrants from Nicaragua, El Salvador mainly, and migration within the border of a country. Migration has become an important factor for the increase in the participation of women in agriculture. Historically, in many countries, migration has been an alternative for additional income. And traditionally, males migrate to search for jobs within their country or crossing national borders. In regions with scarce or impoverished land, the loss of state policy protections for subsistence crops, like in the case of Mexico, and the industrialization of agriculture have produced massive movements of male workers in search for jobs in the cities or to do farm work in other regions in the country or countries. Fewer women from rural areas migrate for wage work. Migration can be seasonal or more permanent due to political, economic factors, and also the characteristics of migration changes over time, and also the migrants too. And one example, once they settle, for example, in the case of Mexicans in the United States, more women are coming. One example is the case of Mexican migration to the US, who had for many decades a circular migration, crossing the border for temporary jobs. However, the turn into permanent stay after 9/11 due to the difficulties of crossing the border, expense, and danger. As a consequence of men's out-migration, rural women in Mexico become full-time farmer laborers to take over the family plots in addition to their domestic chores. In some cases, marginal lands are abandoned as families receive remittances from family members, and women cannot hold that job in such a marginal land. Nevertheless, in Mexico, the proportion of women in the agriculture workforce has increased from 16% in 1980 to 26% in 2000. You can see the difference with other countries, right, in terms of the proportion. Rural women are increasing their numbers as landowners. 20% of ejidatarios are women. From all women working in their own or family plots of land, 66% report production of household consumption, but only 17% for the market, compared to men, 52% for the household, but 26% of the market. Again, you can see the differences of where the assets are going to go. I want to mention another important factor that impact women in agriculture, and that's AIDS, and that's mostly in sub-Saharan countries in Africa. The AIDS epidemics had greater impact of African women due to the biological factors. Female genitalia is more susceptible to transmission, spreads faster when people are malnourished, as well as social and cultural factors, predominant norms, women powerlessness in control of sexual relationships, avoidance of having prevention through education, those things that are not talked or discussed about. In the sub-Saharan region, for every 10 men infected of HIV, 14 women carry the infection. Although some countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, appear to have a slowdown in the incidence rate of HIV infection, the decline of adult labor force has severely impacted food security in an already distressed region. So also women are dying. Women bear the brunt of the impact of AIDS in their communities. They may be sick, but still have to carry both the full array of agricultural work and their traditional household chores. High mortality of males as a consequence of AIDS. The crops that were done by males are now fall in the hands of women. And these are the hard preparation of land before planting. To cope with absence of male help in the heavy tasks, women replace traditional crops for easier crops. That is, women are as able as men to really adapt and try to figure out how to address the challenges that they face. But also, women are left out depending on the particularities of the region. For example, in regions with patrilineal laws, women have access to land through their husbands. In case of death, women lose some or all of their assets. In addition to health programs, nutrition support, anything programmatic that we want to think of women, we have to think in a very holistic way, and we have to to address or try to address all these complexities, all these layers of women. So it's not about to provide them with appropriate technology. It's not enough to approach them with water. It's not enough one single approach. Finally, I will talk briefly of climate change. You know, in some regions, the droughts are more often, longer, and also that has pushed women to do wage labor. And because, many times men are not there, but if men went further to find jobs, women are restrained to stay close by to their families, and they really don't have a bargain power to get better wages. So that's another thing that we have to think. So I have mentioned very briefly this how context matters, right? Depending on different issues. But next, I will like to share with you some thoughts regarding of how to think on policy implementation, because cannot be just one thing or the other. Cannot be even two things. How we think when we have so different conditions of women depending on the region or the country we are talking about, even within the country. What I do with women as ejidatarias and what I do with women, indigenous women in the south of Chiapas or Yucatan area. So this is a conceptual model that is derived from a work that Pfeffer and me did in some other issues, but it comes handy because for me, it helps me to think comprehensively about how to address the role of women in agriculture. So we don't fall into a very narrow definition of women in agriculture just by data collected, by surveys. So we don't forget these nuances of gender roles depending on the religious factors, regions, etc., in the customary purpose. But let me just go with you to explain what I'm thinking. So in this line, we have to think of from the local aspects to more comprehensive things. And of course, we have to address these dimensions, the social and cultural, the economic and the political. In this segment, we go from the informal to the formal. So for example, if we go to local and informal, we can talk about customary practices and how do we, or what do we do to change those, right? Do you think we can work within? Yes, we have to work within, but also will be helpful to have some government policy in that direction. This is going to be hard to link and to establish and to work, but it happens, right? If you ask me if 60 years ago that a woman can be owner of an ejido, people will laugh. Well, now 20% of the ejidatarios are women, right? So things change. In another way, for example, we have to think on the economic aspect of women coming into agriculture, markets for land, labor, competitive wages, and we can make a rather list. And so these aspects can go from the informal to the formal, more established laws, right? For example, in Mexico, the jornaleras, they establish their contract verbally. No, there is no written contract on when they're going to work. So I'm going to work for you for 3 weeks, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and that's it. So, you know, this is an informal way still of an economic issue. When we talk about government policy and international policy, that's a more formal, and also formal can be, the economic aspect can be here. The way we implemented policies many times do not consider other aspects like this or this. And we don't consider how to affect and how to transform the informal aspect, the local aspects of where the women are working and living. So this is just some ideas that I will leave those with you, and I will happy to be for questions. And now next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parra. Our third panelist is Dr. Alexander Travis. He is an associate professor of reproductive biology and wildlife conservation at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell. He's received a number of honors, including the Rotary International Graduate Fellowship, University of Pennsylvania's Pearson Prize, NIH Career Development Award, Pfizer Animal Health Award for Research Excellence, and a SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Scholarship. His primary research interests range from landscape scale approaches to wildlife conservation that focus on human poverty and hunger, to cell and molecular investigations of mammalian sperm. That's a big different type of work. Probably not going to talk about that today, I'm guessing. With diagnostic and therapeutic applications ranging from human fertility to agriculture and wildlife conservation. Maybe you are. He's the director of Cornell Center for Wildlife Conservation and is the chair of the Faculty Advisory Board of the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. Dr. Travis.
This is really just for the camera, but you can put that in the pocket. I'll put it right.
Good. Well, thank you very much, and it's really a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Sarah for organizing this, and thank all of you for sharing this day with us. And as you might have heard from the introduction, one of my passions in life is wildlife conservation, and so my pathway to this topic has been somewhat indirect. I've really grown to want to have an impact on conservation on a landscape scale. And in looking at that, really focusing on human poverty and hunger became apparent as one of the best ways to direct my attention. And in focusing on human poverty and hunger, I've really become, or had my eyes opened to the impacts of attention to women farmers and how much of an impact that can have. And so today I'd like to present what is really a kind of a multidisciplinary case study for some work we're doing in Zambia with several partners, and most notably a Wildlife Conservation Society project that I'll tell you about. And our work on this from Cornell has included economists, food scientists, crop and soil scientists, social scientists, and veterinarians. We've been funded by USAID as well as the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. And the area in Zambia is the Luangwa Valley, which you'll see here. And it's a very remote area in Zambia. And it's known from a wildlife perspective for having very robust populations of wildlife, and in fact, most of the species that were there originally. However, the people in the Luangwa Valley face many challenges. One that's been plaguing them for really decades, if not centuries, has been variable rainfall. Even going back 60 to 80 years, the literature says 1 year is good rain, 1 year is drought, 1 year is flood. So it's very, very difficult for families to be able to plan ahead and think beyond this season. Human and animal disease are really critical factors. The effect of HIV/AIDS has been brought up. Drug-resistant TB, malaria, all affect the human population quite strongly. There's also diseases such as trypanosomiasis, which affect both humans and animals. And in the case of Luangwa Valley, trypanosomiasis precludes any cattle from being reared there. And so this limits farmers to hand-hoe farming because they don't have draft animals. There are also other animal diseases, such as Newcastle disease, which has critical impacts on poultry, and I'll come back to that later. There's a lack of infrastructure in terms of no paved roads. Many of the roads are seasonal, no water, minimal electricity in areas. And of course, that goes hand in hand with lack of market access. If you're a farmer down in the valley, how do you then get your crop products out and add value to them? And limited education. Our surveys show that in the valley, there's an average of about 4 years of education. And so these challenges really impact families in many ways. The vast majority of inhabitants live on less than $1 a day. Over a quarter of the families are headed by a single woman. And this is due both to the impacts of HIV/AIDS as well as male exodus. This area of Zambia does not have metal. And so many of the men go out to the copper belt area where the mining jobs are. And because those jobs are not present in this area in the eastern province. Life expectancy nationwide in Zambia is about 38 years, and it's probably lower in Luangwa Valley. And our surveys suggest that about 94% of the families are chronically food insecure. This is measured on a monthly basis. And so these factors have really led to what is in many ways a fairly desperate situation for families. And under those circumstances, they rely more and more on natural resources as coping mechanisms to get by through short periods of time. Western development efforts have been instituted to try to help generate income in those areas. And this is a good example. This is an example of cotton crop. Unfortunately, this is a national forest in Chifunda, so this is supposed to be a protected area. And so sometimes the development efforts have led to additional problems. And while they do inject some capital, they've caused this area in Zambia, in fact Zambia as a whole, to have one of the highest absolute rates of deforestation in the world. Even though it's a very, very small country, on a per hectare basis, they are one of the major places where forest is being lost. And what happens then is as more farmers are concentrating on cash crops like cotton, they then become very susceptible to changes and fluctuations in that market. When the price of cotton does this and then does this, and more people are deciding to do cotton because the price was here and now it's here, now they don't have income and now they also don't have food. And so that then perpetuates this cycle of them needing to rely more on natural resources. And so against this backdrop, or context, a wildlife biologist named Dale Lewis started an organization called Kamako for Community Markets for Conservation. And Dale basically realized that if we weren't going to do something about hunger and poverty, that conservation measures wouldn't be productive. And Kamako takes a really holistic approach to these set of challenges, all the way from educating farmers in sustainable agriculture to access to high-end urban markets, commodity markets, and things like that. So the way they do this is they first have a very well-trained group of extension officers, all local Zambian people, and they organize families into producer groups. So a group of families that would live near each other would be identified as a producer group. They'd have a lead farmer. And then those producers, instead of selling or having to bring their individual crops all the way to a larger town, which might be several days' journey away, they instead bring them to a local depot. And as you'll see in this photo, these depots have large blackboards out front where all the prices are listed and are very transparent. So this is one way of encouraging the women farmers where they can get the same price. This is gender equity or I should say there's not a lot of gender equity, so it's very difficult for women farmers to negotiate the same prices. And so by having this structure and making the pricing transparent, that's one way to help women farmers. But really, as they organize those producer groups, a major way of doing it is by limiting participation to one member of the household. And in Kamako, 52% of the registered participants are women. Now I said that 25% of the households are headed by a single woman, so you'd expect the number to be at least 25. But they do a good job of also getting women to be the registered participants from other households as well. And that's really important, as you'll see in the subsequent slides. But just moving on further through the model, what happens then is from these local depots, the Kamako trucks can come, pick up that material. The transactions are made at these depots, so the money is being distributed closer to home. And people don't have to spend as much time away from their farm and they become more productive then at work. And so then the Camacco trucks take the material to then a regional trading center. And this would be a town that would have electricity and access to roads. And here, food processing would be done. Value would be added to those crops. So instead of selling peanuts individually, now as a cooperative, they are making peanut butter. Different regional trading centers have different things like extruders or packaging equipment. And then these products then are brought to the headquarters in Lusaka, which is the capital, where they can then go out to different grocery stores. And because they work at scale, there's over 50,000 families participating, they can have stable contracts that are worth a fair amount of money. And in this way, they can then bring that money back to the rural farmers, giving them access to markets that they would have never had. Things like the South African and Zambian commodity exchanges, and even international export markets. So another way that Camacco really takes advantage of looking at farmers individually as men and women is by giving them choice. Camacco doesn't say what crops, we're going to do this year. Farmers have choice, and this goes back to some of the things that were mentioned already with different constraints on time and labor allocation. Certainly they preach diversification of crops. This allows some resilience against drought and flooding. For example, using sweet potatoes and cassava and encouraging their use helps protect farmers against that variation in precipitation. But it also then gives them an opportunity to make new products, new sources of income, such as dried vegetables and fruits and things like that. And in a pinch, if markets do go south, the farmers then can actually eat what they're producing instead of what happens when you rely completely on cotton. But when we get back to those issues of gender and choice, it turns out that women farmers do tend to choose differently. Males tend to choose more maize, whereas women tend to choose groundnuts and honey more. Now, they all tend to do a diversified mix of crops, but it is interesting to see these. And because honey and groundnuts require less field effort, it then does allow them to meet some of those other labor needs. And as it turns out, these also have higher price per unit at the end. So there is a balance in terms of what they recover from these different choices. Now, when we've looked at the impacts of Camacco's activity on yield, it turns out that the women farmers do show significant improvements, and in fact, in comparison to the men as well. So if we look at the area, the arrows in blue, in terms of groundnuts, women farmers in Camacco do significantly better than those outside of Camacco. Same for maize and rice as well. And this could be because, as was mentioned, better adoption of sustainable agricultural practices and using the full complement of conservation farming methods. Or it could also reflect that they were more disadvantaged to begin with. And so they're coming up from a lower starting place. Now, we have done studies that looks at when Camacco goes into an area, they are very effective at working with the communities, because they are members of the communities, at identifying those families that are the worst off. And even though 94% of the families are food insecure, there still is a separation of people who are worse off and better off. And Camacco really does go after those families first that are living on the margins. One area where Cornell scientists, Carmen Marrero in particular in food sciences, has really made a tremendous impact there, has been in hygiene and safety. If you are in the middle of an area without stable electricity, without running water, how can you make value-added food products in a safe way? And this required a lot of education, and Dr. Marrero ran workshops on how to wash your hands, how to clean equipment, and do that in a safe way. And you can see here a picture on the right of having a running water system with clean water for which the workers can wash their hands. And this has really made an enormous impact. Camacco now has all their products tested for safety and quality, and has been able to meet those standards, enabling them to get those large contracts that I mentioned earlier. When we got there in 2005, this really wasn't the case. The peanut butter production that you could see was hand roasting out on an open area, basically on a dirt road. Sorting and milling was all done without good hygiene practices. And now, over the past few years, it's become increasingly mechanized and having really a skilled workforce making these products. And you can see some of the products on the bottom, the peanut butter, the polished rice. They produce high energy protein supplement, or HEPs, and have large contracts with World Food Program, Catholic Relief Services. And this really has multiple benefits. You're producing something of value, bringing more money back to the farmers, but you're also meeting local needs there without having to import these things in from South Africa, which previously had been the custom. And you'll see on the bottom right, even Camako is now engaged in all sorts of commercial market fairs and commodity exchanges, things like that. So they're really growing at this time. Now, from a business perspective, this growth does come associated with different costs, and Camako has now local depots and regional trading centers on both sides of Luangwa Valley, down in the valley itself, on the eastern plateau, and now on the western plateau, and that does come with a lot of costs and infrastructure in building up those areas and serving now an area of about 35,000 square kilometers. But as you see from the regional trading centers that have existed for several years, they are tracking towards a break-even point, which is very encouraging. And the diversification of crops and crop products is certainly very helpful at that. Now I'd like to change gears slightly. We've talked about having women farmers as participants, having them have choice, giving them access to different markets, and giving them fair access in pricing. But there's other sets of activities that have typically been looked at as kind of women's roles in this area in Zambia. And if this were a classroom, I would show this picture and I'd say, well, what's going on here? And I'll save that rhetorical question, because usually the answer is slash and burn farming. But what's actually going on here is these children are hunting. And they're hunting for rodents. And if they identify where a rodent burrow is, they can then set a fallow field on fire, which will drive the rodents down towards their burrow so they can escape the flames. And then one of the children, as you see, this young man with the hand hoe, will be there ready to knock them off. And that is a really important source of dietary protein in this area. And when we look at then what we think of from a Western perspective as the more traditional sources of dietary protein, when we think about cattle, well, I've already said they can't have cattle there. And well, what else? Well, goats, and there are some goats. There are some diseases that constrain them, but because of the variable precipitation, it's hard to build that up, and it's hard to generate a market for it in terms of transporting them. So many families have chickens. And when we first started going there in 2005, what we found was, sadly, although 85% of the families were raising backyard chickens, between 50 to 100% of those birds would die before sale or safe consumption. And this was mostly due to Newcastle disease. And this is why there is such a reliance on methods such as this for dietary protein. And historically, raising the poultry, because it was as I mentioned, it was kind of a low yield effort. It was a marginal effort. There wasn't a lot of profit generated from it, and it was thought of as a woman's activity. And now, after helping with the International Rural Poultry Center and working with Camako, we've helped them institute community vaccination program for Newcastle disease, where a team of one man and one woman are chosen from the community to learn how to be community vaccinators, and then the farmers pay for this vaccine for their birds. And we found that as long as the vaccine's being administered correctly, there's a very marked improvement in poultry production, so that families now stably have about 30 birds per household. And you think, well, great, we just solved a protein problem. But that's where the research comes in, and it turns out that's not really true at all. Because the difference between these households and these children is which ones go to school, and that depends on which ones have chickens. Because the families aren't eating the birds, they're using them, as many other cultures do with cattle and other livestock, to sell so that they can pay for their children's uniforms and things to send them to school, which is terrific. But we have to be careful when we perform research that we're looking at multiple metrics, not just the one we think we're solving, but actually how people are using these new skills or resources that they have. And so we've been sending veterinary students there since 2005 and helping them with husbandry instead of bringing the birds into their homes at night, have elevated stick roosts, which actually keeps the birds safer from predation and also healthier. This is a picture of the community vaccination work being done. But now to address these issue of really health and child health and development and nutrition, we've piloted with Kamako egg layer facilities. And you'll see one here. The Emozi group here is a women's cooperative, and this is their egg layer facility. And these, over the first year, the data were very, very strong. Even after paying for the inputs in the building and the feed for these egg-laying birds, there was a net increase of 44% in their income and an increase in 96% in the eggs eaten, in the amount of eggs eaten in these villages. So really tremendous impacts, and Kamako is now scaling this up to have 8 of these facilities, and we hope to grow that even further. But this raises really important questions about economics. Do people have enough money to buy enough eggs to have the positive impacts on childhood development and things like that? And so with that, I'd just like to end with a thank you to just some of our students. Sam Bell, natural resource economist who did a lot of the work on yields and income, which I didn't show. And Sarah Dumas, a veterinary student who's going to be coming back for a PhD to look at these impacts on the relationship of poultry production and women's roles in the household and women's income, and then also child health and development. And I saw one of the food science students, Matt, somewhere, he might be hiding in the back, but Matt has just recently been out to Zambia with a SMART team, helping them develop some of those dried fruit products and some new things such as biscuits and processed food bars and things like that, helping them to develop new products and hopefully new economic opportunities. So thank you.
I'm K.V. Raman, and I'm in international programs and one of the associate directors there. So we have a number of students here who are taking our courses in international agriculture and rural development. And as a part of the course, they do go into developing countries. Faculty are involved in many development projects. And on one side, we are looking at the needs of the woman and trying to develop methodologies or technologies which would address the woman's needs, like what in the last presentation we just heard, how these technologies really help. So there's a lot of passion in it, but as they start developing it, you have different players which come into play. One is the private sector, the other one is the public sector, then you have the advocacy groups. And these, I would say, are groups which are supported by huge amount of donor funds or privately generated funds. I mean, you have groups such as the Earth Liberation Front, or you have Greenpeace and several others. So on one side, you're trying to develop these technologies or whatever, but then you get blindsided by these advocacy groups which have penetrated the highest levels in the government, policymakers, and who have actually derailed, for example, the regulatory system in Africa. They have derailed the regulatory system in Bangladesh. I mean, I could go on and let you know how the views of some of these advocacy groups have penetrated at the highest levels. So on the other side, you have these useful tools which are there to make a significant impact. So the examples here would be, hybrid seed, which has brought in a great amount of significant advances in agriculture. But there are a number of advocacy groups which are against hybrid seeds. And they use the banner of Monsanto, saying, and in fact today as I was coming in the radio, Democracy Now! Had a big talk by Vandana Shiva, who is one of the most prominent women advocacy leaders, who's against technology. She wants farmers to go back to organic agriculture, in other words, to the primitive days. She's against, almost anything to do with, in the name of globalization. She has actually prevented many of these small farmers, I'm talking of women in particular, and there are many Vandana Shivas out there who have actually taken such a major role in affecting the lives, in my view, millions of women.
Okay, I'm not sure if you had a question involved in
But
that.
my question is, how do you deal with the advocacy groups compared to development scientists who are trying to bring a change?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with Dr. Travis to say, have you had this issue, or not this particular seed issue, but the advocacy groups with whom you've had to deal in your context? And then we'll ask the others if they have as well, or have global issues.
Yeah, so we haven't had too much of an issue dealing, say, on the poultry side with any of the vaccines. That it's a pretty accepted technology. GMO, though that's a big issue, so it's not allowed. Right now, Kamako is primarily organic. Very few of the farmers have access to fertilizers of any kind anyway. Cotton and tobacco, that kind of outgrower scheme, there are pesticides that are given out with those seeds. But in terms of the food products, Kamako itself is more organic on that side. So we don't really deal with too many of these issues.
Yes, okay. Dr. Feldman?
It's an interesting question you raise. I guess for me, one of the most important points about that claim is that one asks, what are the issues that are being addressed by these advocacy groups? And how appropriate would it be for us to think through them and find out why they're raising these kinds of issues? It seems to me that the way in which you positioned it was people who are real scientists doing good work and these bad guys not allowing things to change. If you think about some of these advocacy groups, many of them are supported by their claims are substantiated by high-quality scientists, some Cornell graduates, in fact. It seems to me that instead of just posing it as a negative, asking what they're raising and why they're raising it and why they're raising it the way they are. And this follows a second piece of the question, and that is, we sit here and we have the luxury and the resources to figure out what good development projects are. And I think in many cases, most people, and I would almost assume everybody, is sort of interested in the humanistic kind of sensibility about that. We're trying to improve people's lives and so on and so forth. We don't ask ourselves, how does this transform in ways that are not only positive but also negative? What are the costs of transforming an agricultural sector with a new technology that may or may not benefit some people and may or may not hurt other people? So sometimes we are not terribly reflective about how we respond to the kinds of concerns that are raised, and very often they do speak on behalf of a large constituency. Not always, but very often they do. And they represent interests that are not often included in the ways in which we develop technologies. And let me give you the example of the rice mill. I think rice mills did save lots of women the arduous task of decky production. This, old style, fulcrum, not dangerous in a big sense, but dangerous in an uncomfortable sense, and people did get hurt by it. But the intervention, good guys making good machines, transformed who had access to the employment that was generated, who had access to the rice shaft that was providing feed for chickens, who had access to the employment that was generated for other women in other households when they did decky work. Nobody considered that. That's such a simple, easy way to do it. And while I can't tell you that there was a specific, Greenpeace, kind of antipathy for it, I think it's precisely that kind of comment, that kind of concern about how it transforms household productive activities more broadly, or the requirement to be dependent on the market more broadly. For example, buying chicken feed as opposed to having it as part of your household subsistence, that people are not so happy with. And so I think we might be a little humble about asking what are the specific issues that are being raised and how do I actually address them? Instead of posing it in this kind of very antithetical, dichotomous way.
I think Dr. Parra.
Yes, I will add a little bit on this. I think we put in the same bag everything. We should not, why, I don't understand, in many cases, reject, for example, a good hybrid seed that will be resistant to drought, only because we will oppose Monsanto manipulation of the reproduction and control, which is wrong. So we have to separate the issues and analyze, well, what can be done alternatively? And what I hear along the universities is that governments have reduced the support for research in universities in third world countries. And therefore, they are not able to develop, appropriate, in this case, to follow the example, seeds that will be used in their country, that they can be reproduced and sell and market by local aspects rather than a multinational. So that's one other thing. And unfortunately, many of these agencies that are fighting for the poor and the rights of women or this and that, actually they have their own agendas, right? So again, I agree with Shelley. We have to analyze, to examine under very different lenses what is going on, right? But not to fall in the position of we should not accept ever any hybrid seeds here in this country, or we should not, these absolute points, push us into ideological constraints rather than to, a broader rational perspective. So for me, the bad guy really is Monsanto. But, hey, that's my opinion.
Just a couple of perspectives from my World Food Program days. In about the mid-'90s, I remember talking to some soybean folks saying, at the time, you guys have been missing a big boat here, and that is the European market at the time. This was like mid-'90s. And my own analysis was that we just assumed that these things that Americans eat are okay, and everybody will think they're okay, and science is good, and let's just do them. And living in Europe at the time, I certainly learned that Europeans are extremely emotional about their food, much more so than Americans are, and so there was a lot of concern about whatever this was, even if people already were eating some of it or much of it. And so that, I think that some of the original organizers or promoters of these new products didn't pay enough attention to that. Maybe they were only thinking of them as a market, but they certainly didn't think of them enough from a political perspective. And then, of course, what we saw a lot of were European interests with those very strong views then influencing African interests, for example. But in Zambia, to follow up on Alex's point about Zambia not allowing GMO food, it was in 2002, actually shortly after I left the organization, that there was a big drought in southern Africa, 2002, 2003. And if you might remember, the Zambians and Zimbabwe both said they wouldn't take any GMO food. Well, they had been having this for some time. It was never an issue, but now it was an issue. And so the Zimbabweans finally took corn that had been milled, because one of their issues was they didn't want any of the kernels potentially to migrate and infect their fields. So they took the ground corn. The Zambians wouldn't take the ground corn. And what happened at that point was USAID invited the Zambians to come to the States to show them how safe their research showed that this corn was. But what they never answered to the Zambian satisfaction was, well, what happens if it's a very, very high percentage of your diet? Where's your research that shows that? And they didn't have it. So to me, it was kind of a clumsy approach to try to solve a problem that then did not get solved. Different question, different direction. I think she had her hand up first, please.
Thank you. My name is Gabriela Monsalvo. I come from Mexico. And the questions are the next. I am really happy to be here. I am really sad because I am here with Dr. Feldman. I think that the world has a really oldest doubt with our rural women. At the 70s, everybody says, oh, go ahead with woman on development, in development. Okay. And after that, gender in development. Okay, gender in development. Now, empowerment with development. But the point is that we have strategic and practical needs that the rural woman has, and we are not resolve these kind of problems. So my specific question for everybody is, what do you think that is the main risk that we have now when we can't put in design of public policy gender view, since a sensitive scheme, because the rural women are working with or without public policy, with this kind of view of gender. And now the rural women are working with, when we talk about gender and agricultural and food and climatic change, now we are trying to put this biggest homework again with rural women, trying to push and work again so hard because we need much more food for a whole world. So now we have more rural women that are involved trying to do the things. But now, at least in Mexico last year, and even at least some months after that I come here, the rural women are telling me, Gabby, if the political men, if the government, even my husband, my neighbor, my sister, my brother, if they don't know what are the things that I am feeling right now, I'm sorry, but I have to go home. If they can, sorry, maybe I will be divorced, maybe I will be in another way. So all these kind of thinkings are changing so fast. Some traditional roles that we thought, by example, is because we don't have men with them in farms, they have to involve. And this is a traditional role that we don't have now. Why? In some rural place in Mexico, is because a lot of men who are in US, now they go on to Mexico. And now they are arriving, and the men are close to the women, but they don't want to know anything about agricultural work. So, what happened? And now we have more and more homeworks to do. But the specific point is what happened with the public policy. At least in Mexico, we are pushing so hard in order to think that it's not just the rural women's work, even the professional women who are involved, like extensionist work, like designer public policy or something, and if they don't have to care, all this work that the rural women are doing now, like really empowerment with or without support, they are working too. Thank you.
Let me think. Women have been continue their own survival forever in many circumstances under many situations. But what I have read, what I have seen in the last, believe me, I'm not in favor of the Mexican government. That's my first. But in the last 2 or 3 sexenniums, they have, at least they say, they have invested heavily in addressing the most marginal and gender issues, women issues, so they can improve their lot, right? And at least in nutrition, we have some data that addresses the issue of progressa, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there are some help, but you are right, Gary. We have to go beyond. Now, how, where? I think this is a job of forever, and I am optimist. I think we have gained a lot of things, women. But we are also, by class issues. And I think we scientists or NGOs or these organizations for like Greenpeace and all that, they are thinking among themselves, and they seldom go down to say, well, what is it with you? What do you need, right? And then we have the unintended consequences. But hey, we try. Right? So it's not something that I don't understand or I don't talk to you. It's something that we tend not to do because, hey, we know everything or almost everything, right? So yes, but there is more awareness. I see more men interested in women issues, taking into account these issues. I see lots of women. Look what Catherine is doing. I mean, this is wonderful. And this is just one of many, I think, points of blocks of productive and positive things.
I was recently at a conference for the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and this issue came up from a different perspective, not about women, but about youth. Someone had tracked the average age of farmers, which have been getting older and older, and now what we do if we really want to invest in the long term. So I think it's an issue that's a broad issue in many places, but it has a lot of different ramifications. Gentleman in front of the row, please.
My name is Randy Parra. I have to be careful when I say here. And I had to make a decision to come here. There are so many seminars at Cornell. And Jim Levine and I were having a discussion a few minutes ago, and I said, you go to the seminar of Burkina Faso, and I'm going to go to this seminar, and then we'll talk later to see what happened. The thing I want to say about Dr. Levine is this. He has a sign on his wall that says, not for us, but with us. And I think this is what the first speaker from India was saying. And you were doing with us, as Dr. Travis, not for us. And I think this is a important point. But actually, I told Shelley Feldman that I came here to harass her. And now I'm going to tell you about my trip to Bangladesh. I'm in a village in Bangladesh, and we're having a meeting. In the meeting, there were no women. So I said to the village head, aren't there any women in this village? And the village head said, go get the women. And so the women came, and they stood over there. We were here, the men were here, and the women were over there. And then the meeting went on, and on the way out, I said the lady came up to me, and this is where Dr. Travis is, if I'd known him. The woman came up to me and she said, we need your help. I said, to do what? She said, to get rid of the rats in the rice field. You should have known what you were doing, I guess. It's hard to talk about women in general. You have to talk about women in context. And the context is so different. And in Nigeria, I go to the village, and the lady says, don't talk to my husband, he doesn't know anything. Talk to me, I'm the guy who does the marketing. I'm the lady that does the marketing. And then I go to the Philippines, and I'm playing golf, and my caddy is a woman. I said, and I talked to her about a little bit, and she said, I'd rather be planting rice. Now, I don't have a question, Shelley, for you, except I don't think it's important to have how many people are in agriculture or not agriculture, how many women. I think the important thing is who's making the decision. And when you go to a household and you talk to people, first of all, the man says something, and pretty soon he goes, you ask him, well, what kind of fertilizer do you use? And he said, gosh, I don't know. My wife. You know, and then the woman comes in. So it's that kind of conversation that goes on all the time. So I don't know whether we're changing or getting better or getting worse, because you said this cultural revolution has been going on for a long time. So I don't know whether we're better off today than we were before, but I still think one of the problems I have working for Cornell and working for Erie comes back to not for us, but with us.
Well, let me applaud Randy for a couple of things.
That's the end of my speech.
In case you didn't know, let me applaud Randy for a couple of things. Number one is not many of us can say, I went to this village, I went to this village, I went to this village. Some of us can say, I went to Erie, I went to FAO, I went to here and there. And that is really important when we think about doing something for or with. We can't do things with if we don't know the with. No. We don't know who we're working with. So, I must say, Randy, and you know how I feel about this, you are an exception in terms of dragging people from these research centers and sticking them in the field and getting a handle on it. I hope you didn't interpret me as saying feminization should mean counting numbers. I'm saying when we look at the literature, what you see is how many.
I don't want to lose your friendship.
No, but I'm serious. I'm just trying to say that we tend to think about feminization in terms of numbers. Most people think about it in terms of numbers, whether it's the proportion of women in the labor force compared to other women, and the agricultural labor force compared to other women, or compared to men. They don't think about the processes involved, the processes of feminization. But here is where I differed from most of the literature. The processes of feminization does not mean that now more women are acting as if they're heads of household. Feminization is also about the quality and conditions of employment and work and labor. Okay? It's not only who makes decisions it's the conditions of being employed. I mean, if one, I don't know why I'm screaming. If it's not simply about who makes the decision. It's about, the conditions of my work. If I am only given a job that's pays half the price of men, and now I can get men to get the same salary I get, that's the interest of an employer. And this is what the other part of feminization is about. It's an overall reduction in work security, whether it's in terms of what we see in the US, in terms of the loss of benefits, yes, or it's the conditions of work in the sense of 19 and a half hours, so I don't have to pay you health insurance. So what's really important for us when we look at this is not to only see it as a category of women. It's really to see it as a social relationship that unfolds in relation to changing conditions of employment. And that includes opportunities for wage employment, as well as undervaluation of non-wage, in-kind or exchange labor, all of the things that shape how people put together and adapt to their social circumstances for survival. So I think it's really important. The other piece, and I just let me take advantage of having the mic, it's about the new green revolution. Now I come out of thank you for not noticing, I come out of the old green revolution, in the sense that I looked at the green revolution, in addition to its benefits, increasing triple cropping, so on, labor, intensity of production, there are also negative consequences of the green revolution that somehow are getting lost or not being accounted for in the reimagining or the imagining of the second, and I call it the gene revolution rather than the green revolution. It's not for or against it, but what did we learn from the past revolution? We have learned a lot. We've learned a lot about soil quality. We've learned a lot about labor demand. We've learned these things. What is it saying to us as we move into another revolution? And I actually don't think we give enough attention to those kinds of questions. And we have a load of literature that can help us do this. So just saying there's a new revolution, and I'm not saying anyone said that, but just looking at a new revolution as if we can't learn from the old, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. And so it's scary when it comes back as farce.
Shelley, all new technologies have a plus and a minus,
Absolutely.
including this cell phone.
Okay, we need microphones if we're going to talk. Before I call, does anybody else on the panel want to comment?
Well, if I have a last comment to make, I get an idea, a recommendation of what will be good to improve the conditions of women in general, rural women particularly. I would say two things: access to resources and education, and that will take us a long way. And of course, if we want to learn about the village, ask the women. And I think that's right.
Okay. And as the next speaker comes up, I'm going to put somebody on the spot in a minute if she doesn't mind. So I'm giving her a sense, just a chance to think about this. Ellen, the last questioner brought to mind the fact that in different households you get different answers. And it might be really useful to share a little bit of information about how, for instance, the World Bank goes about, or doesn't, as the case may be, asking the right questions of the right people in the household. I think you were involved from a rural perspective about working on that. So shortly, if you don't mind. Thank you. You've been very patient.
My question is, would each of you like to speak to the corporate problem with resources and access to resources by each of the settings that you're familiar with, and how that is being looked at? Or is this completely exempt because the places are so remote, or are they being influenced by the corporate greed and all that? That's my question.
Could you identify yourself too?
Linda Iannone, alumni.
Okay. Sure.
So the role of corporations, I think, is very interesting and important. So on the one hand, we have the companies that are taking part in those development efforts, the cotton and tobacco that I mentioned. And I've been in truck rides with those guys, from airports and things, and they really, truly believe that they're doing the right thing and a good thing because of the metrics that they're looking at. They're looking at how much income is being generated by cotton. And if you do a comparison, I think it was about 2006 or 2007, Comaco did a survey, and over 90% of the income on the plateau is being generated by cotton. And so if that's the only metric you're looking at, then that's terrific. I mean, they're doing a great job at injecting income into that area. However, they're not doing the multidisciplinary viewpoint and research to see the other impacts that they're having. And so I think that's something that corporations do tend to, and government agencies need to be careful about is if you're going to do an intervention to produce X effect, to make sure you're looking at Y and Z as well to see how else it might be playing out. But Comaco has had very favorable and good relations with a number of corporations, and I'll single out General Mills in particular, who went out and visited them and was very impressed with what they were trying to do, and took their Zambian food technologist and a Cornell NPS student back to St. Paul, Minnesota for training, and trained them on some extruder equipment, and then wound up donating extruder equipment to Comaco and helping them work on their products. And so I think corporations can be a tremendous force for good as well, and it just depends on the relationship and what they are doing.
Anybody else?
Sure, I can say something. I guess remote doesn't carry much weight any longer because corporations change values in land, for example. So if they're not personally invested in a particular space, they've recalibrated the value of land. They've encouraged other producers to consolidate land holding, for example, and transform agriculture, reintroduce things like in Bangladesh, it's shrimp farming as opposed to rice production. So I guess this is just sort of a compliment to Alex that, everything is good and bad, but it also has ramifications in altering the landscape, as it were, both literally and figuratively. And it's really important whether a particular corporation is in place or if it's influencing either policy or the rewards that get associated with certain practices, then I think it changes rural landscapes in very significant ways, and divisions of labor and the kinds of adaptation strategies or ways that mediate the costs of some of these negative things for households and for families.
Agriculture is, after all, a business, and so I think one of the pluses of some of the new developments are that more and more private sector are paying more attention, and they don't have to all be big, huge name brand companies, but many smaller investors, I think, are helping to build capacity in different places in Africa, whether it is processing or other very significant new, well, not new technologies, but new implementation of technologies in many places in the developing world.
And just to add one thing, Kamako, the organization we work with, is organized as a Zambian business. So it is an agricultural business that is trying to achieve really, the triple bottom line of social benefits, economic benefits, and environmental benefits. So I don't think we should, put it in a black and white view in corporations.
Okay, Ellen, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Mihela. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Applied Economics and Management program. I had the pleasure of working with Catherine at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she pushed us so much to think about gender issues, and also served as a wonderful mentor and role model for all of the young women who worked within the foundation, and men. I think you wanted me to say a few words about surveys and data collection, and I think this is a really important point, especially for these large-scale surveys that are used to generate poverty statistics and are used by governments to generate statistics. For instance, like 70% of the world's food is produced by women, or agricultural labor is done by women. And a lot of these surveys, they often will ask just the male head of the household a question, or just one person. And there have been some interesting analyses of these surveys and experiments done with these surveys that show that you get systematically different reporting about household expenditures and other activities within the household based on who you're asking the questions to. So one of the things I worked on at the foundation was to try and fund better data collection at scale, and we worked alongside the World Bank Living Standards and Measurement Study program to try and generate better survey instruments, to try and learn about where these instruments were doing well and what the problems were, and how we can improve data collection at scale that then it allows decision makers, policy makers to have access to better information about what's actually going on. So certainly gender issues were a huge, huge part of that. Hopefully we're going to have more data, better data now in the next few years to come, and more attention paid to how to collect data well.
Thanks very much. That's one of those others that's been around forever and ever that people don't do, and that's the gender age disaggregation. When they collected that, makes a huge difference. Please.
Hi, my name is Katie. I work in the Dyson School. I'm a former graduate student there, and I now work as a staff researcher. So it's like I never finished graduate school, really. Just continue to research. So my question is I work a lot with private sector companies that are interested in linking farmers to markets. So we work with a lot of small-scale farmers and a lot of large global companies that want to see that a lot of these important linkages happen and be able to say something about welfare impacts. And so there's a big push to kind of understand, okay, well, we're going to incorporate more women in our organization, and that means we're going to have nutritional impacts. And the private sector really has that sort of down. Like, you give a woman a job, you're automatically going to have these nutrition impacts. And one of the things that we're sort of finding, and I wanted to sort of ask you about, is a lot of these jobs, like Shelley's mentioning, are temporary, they're not on contracts, they're on seasonal labor. And I'm sort of interested to hear you talk a little bit about what do we know about nutritional impacts for women and their ability to invest in their families? How does that change when it's temporary versus contractual? And given that we don't have a lot of good data on this, where are you kind of thinking we can go as researchers to sort of, either in the data, in the existing data that there is, or what are sort of strategies that we can use to kind of understand, like, is this really even an accurate thing that we're sort of assuming happens?
That's a terrific question, actually. And I don't think there is the data. I think there is an assumption, and there is evidence that women who are employed tend to put money back into household needs and nutrition and health and even supportive education, and cash transfer programs support that as well. But I don't think we have data that would be disaggregated by full-time, part-time. In fact, there's such little data on temporary and seasonal workers that we just don't know. I would assume that, I think following your, Catherine, your interest as well, that education will improve nutrition over time. Yes. But I don't know if it's more or less for seasonal work. I think we have to go, I'm going to go back to Travis's point that if you embed it in the kinds of households that have the ability to not need the child's labor, because part of the family labor edit, which I didn't really mention, is it's women and children's labor. It's not just women's labor, this household labor that actually enables the household to reproduce itself over generations. And so I don't think we yet have the data. I think it's a terrific question that we need to have. We have to also acknowledge that there is part-time work. And we don't even, that's why the feminization of labor, as I was trying to share with you in this third way, not a number, but a set of relationships, is critical because we don't acknowledge that work. Labor surveys often, not always, often don't collect that data. So I think we're in a kind of quandary, and hopefully with questions like that, some people will be more cognizant of being attentive to that kind of question.
Actually, there are some partial studies on that direction. In general, when women have earned money, that money will benefit the family and mostly the children. And they're invested on food. What we don't have very much of complete data is the follow-up in terms of, as Shelley mentioned, comparison of, okay, if you are full-time, year-round employed, how much benefit the nutrition of your children have versus the part-time, for example. But in general, it has been shown again and again that as soon as the woman has access to resources, the benefit of these resources go to their families. So yes, there is improvement on the nutrition of children, with certain limitations, because who makes the decisions? So the microfinance is helping women to gather and get assets. This woman that we visited in January, she was able to buy 3 cows, and the income generation was significant. So soon a motorcycle was bought. So I said to her, do you drive a motorcycle? And she said, I'm learning. And she laughed. And so, so this is the thing. So I was thinking, well, what was it? I don't want to think for her, but how useful was the motorcycle? The husband was there. Usually the husband was worried, was using the motorcycle. And maybe it's very good because then he can go to get jobs further away and get more income to the household. I mean, I'm not prejudging, right? But the woman said, I can't keep as much milk as I want for my children. And before, when the 1 cow was for my husband, I couldn't, because it was all for sale. So now, if I want milk in the morning and milk at night, I decide. So you see, that benefits in general. Education and access to resources for women benefit the household. Yes.
I was just wondering if you could comment on de-feminization of agriculture, and as you get more value addition and mechanization in villages, and how that's going to change the power dynamics in the households as men take over roles that are traditionally performed by women, and how you can consider that in future interventions, and especially if you don't know what's going to happen, like the rice mill, sorry. You could just comment on that.
It's part of the thinking. I think anybody who's moving in with a new program, whether it's a development program or a business, has to take fully into account that they don't necessarily. They have to think through what happens when this happens, what happens when there's more income, what happens when men essentially take over the process. It's not well enough done. And so on the other end, women are just left to cope and go back to the non-paying field jobs as opposed to even the partially paying jobs that they had before that the men have now taken over. I don't have a real answer other than it's a real problem that anybody has to think through the residual effects of what otherwise would look like a really successful project. We've certainly found that the more mechanized a program is, the more it becomes male, even if it starts female. And the larger the product and the more cash involved in the product, the more likely it is that men will take over. And that also includes, it's one reason why horticulture and small animal production are much more often kind of okay to invest in from a perspective of supporting women, because they're not likely to be otherwise taken over. Do you have any?
No, that's
I am a PhD student about sociology. So in the global policy discourse on food, agriculture, and food security, there's a lot of productionist language. So Yabio would say if you give women equal access to productive resources, the yield would increase by 20 to 30%. If you're talking about food security, it's not just about production and supply, but you have to think about access and adequacy and use and all that nutrition aspect. In saying that means a woman has more role in providing food for the family, preparing food, and incredible role in nutrition. And these roles, we haven't just discovered in the 2000s. As Shelley pointed out, we knew them a long time ago. But they haven't really been mainstreamed into the policy discourse, along with the productionist side of feminization of agriculture. And so I'm wondering, what's inhibiting this, and how can we go about pointing out not only the production side, but the social reproduction side of agriculture?
So I think that's an interesting question, and I'll just go back to Zambia for an example with Kamako. Is as they introduce new crops and try to encourage diversification, concomitant with that, there are field days with education on nutrition and soybeans, for example, and how do you prepare this and how do you store this? And if floods come, how long can cassava stay underwater before it has to be pulled up? And there's training that this corporation is doing that goes hand in hand with that. I'm not sure how many other places are doing that kind of holistic approach, but it can be done. But I'm not sure how many people are doing it.
I was going to say the food security question is an interesting one when you think about small-scale producers who are producing for themselves. All of the technologies go into oftentimes subsistence, and so with horticulture in particular and so on. So there's a haunting, however, in all of this discussion about populations growing, and the only way to resolve the problem is with large-scale agriculture. And we're not really spending that much giving as much attention, particularly with the turn from policy to urban policy and concern about cities and so on, and resources in cities, to what the costs have been, or will be, or are ongoing, of the loss of small-scale agriculture as producers are forced to be under subsistence, producers given lack of access to resources as well as food. So I guess one of the questions might be, or one of the ways to think about it, is if food security is already overdetermined by a sense that security is through the market, then we've already lost the policy incentive to actually support smaller scale producers. And they're increasingly a smaller proportion of the agricultural community, even though they produce a large amount of food for local communities.
Go ahead.
Thinking on the availability of food and food systems, we are not lacking of food. We have plenty of food, so much that when it's storage, a third of it is lost. Some of them is just completely on waste because there was no distribution. There was not distribution. If the smallholder stops producing, it's not going to affect hunger. They are going to affect hunger of themselves because they are producing for self-subsistence. So the point is, beyond that, if we have so many people in small holdings in marginal lands, what are we thinking to do with these populations when they abandon and they are not able to, the viability of their farms is not anymore here? what are the alternatives? What jobs? What possibilities are there for them? And so that's the challenge for many countries and for many regions, in many regions in the world. So what will happen to those? And that's what happens. That's what famines are. Suddenly there is a big change, a war, drought, a flood, and we have the impact on millions of people, most of them the very poor. So so those are open questions, right?
Your question is a really good one, and it just reminds me of another reason why I spend time and effort on girls' education, because women do have such an all-encompassing role, including everything in the household, including taking care of the children, including doing often unpaid work to fulfill every other obligation of the family, that if a girl can count and read, it means that she has every opportunity to be much more productive, and her children have every opportunity to be much healthier and to go to school themselves. But thank you for the question. Other? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Marchek, and I'm a PhD student in development sociology. And this is starting to echo some of the other questions you've already been asked, but why is there this persistent assumption within agricultural research that a lack of infrastructure and market access is a challenge to women in agriculture, where new research has been coming out showing that with market access, a lot of the crops are reassigned from traditional female crops into cash crops for males. And how does this change our assumptions and the framing of the challenges that face women in agriculture and our framing of the issues in general of agriculture?
So when I framed the lack of infrastructure as a challenge, that wasn't exclusive to women in agriculture. That was for everyone there. And truly it is a challenge, because if everyone in a village has the same number of chickens, then who's going to buy anybody else's chickens? So there has to be some place to sell what you produce. And so I think the market access is really essential for those families to make an income so they can live up to their aspirations and what they're trying to achieve. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is, so the food crops can become your cash crops as they gain in more value. And that's actually something that in many ways Camaco's trying to do. They're trying to make the food crops become equal in value to the cotton in terms of the income it'll give the family, so that there is more emphasis placed on sustainable production of food crops, so that the families are not as susceptible to variations in the market prices, and they then have something there. So it may be that because the situation is more extreme, if you will, in the sense that we haven't run into, in a sense yet, the negative effects of that market access.
And the only example that I can think of now is in my last visit in Uganda. What I found is that families were desperate, women desperate to find ways to have cash through wages or to change it into cash crops to ensure the education of their children. So education of the children became the thing to do, because otherwise they don't see any future for them. The landholdings are small, the commodities are low price. I mean, they see exactly what is coming for them. So yes, women also change to cash crops, and it's for one of that is one of the reasons, education.
There's also a shift in markets. I mean, just remember that every time you marketize, you're making people dependent on cash. If there were other forms of exchange, cooperative exchanges, for example, that you highlighted earlier, then you'd have a different dependence on cash. If schools were really free, as a public policy, you'd have different, but what's happening is the entire economy is actually being marketized. So there is increased demand on on cash income for exchange. But there used to be ways in which that was mediated by local markets and different forms of exchange, including some cash. But there used to be a way in which you can go to the countryside and get eggplant, quite cheaply, and in the urban areas it was much more expensive. And it was precisely because the wages and so on and so forth calibrated those kinds of differences. So it's hard to think about this transition period, I think is precisely what you're saying, in this process of marketizing everything, then what you're left with is a need for cash income. When the market played a smaller role in people's everyday lives because there were resources that were accessed in different ways, I like your use of the word access and availability, then it seems to me the question becomes even more pertinent. I remember going in Tanzania and asking about mchicha, which is like a spinach local thing that every household grew, and they said, oh yeah, but they're bringing in new seed and we're now going to upgrade it, and now my husband's going to do it. It's not going to be part of the household garden that was attached to the house. And so you're quite right, it's being transformed, but over time it's not going to matter if it's men or women. They're all going to be wage laborers as opposed to be part of other forms of a more complex configuration of opportunities for subsistence. Not subsistence literally, but for social subsistence.
Okay, I think we're about out of time. Before we close, are there any final comments anybody wants to make? Just a couple of small commercials. I see Francine Jasper in the back of the room. Is that, do I? Yes? And among the programs that she runs is a program for high school students to spend a day at Cornell in September, I think. They write a paper and they get involved in a certain topic. And then if they're chosen as one of the best papers, they get to go to the World Food Prize ceremony in Des Moines with lots of other high school students from not only around the country but around the world. It's a really wonderful program. If you know any budding 10th or 11th or 12th graders, I would encourage you to see Francine. It's a statewide program that she runs from here. Second is I brought a project that we did with the Chicago Council of Girls Grow a Vital Force in Rural Economies. And I raise it now for one main reason, and that's because of the issue about data and data collection. We had real serious issues trying to verify a lot of the different suppositions that people have made over time, like some of the ones people have asked about now. But we were warned by others who have done projects about girls that a lot of the data just don't exist. And so it's a great opportunity for people who care about these general areas and who want to be able to develop systems to better count and understand girls and women and gender or agricultural issues as they relate to both gender and age. Finally, we want to thank Sarah for all of her work putting this together, and to thank Ronnie Kaufman for his leadership with the entire international program in general and with this in particular. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks to you, Catherine, and to all of our wonderful panelists for an insightful discussion, and thanks to you for your participation. So before we break for the reception, I'd like to invite you to learn more about AWARE through the IPCal's website. You can find information there, and you can also connect through there to join a listserv where you can hear about related activities that are ongoing. And I'd also like to invite you, speaking of commercials, to our next IPCal's 50th anniversary event, which is Friday, April 5th. And we'll be celebrating the partnership between IPCal's and the Peace Corps, which is an enduring one that's been strong for several decades and continues to grow. The acting director of the Peace Corps, Carrie Hessler-Radelet, will be speaking that evening, as well as doing other campus events throughout the day. And we'll also hear from our own university leadership and some returned Peace Corps volunteers. So I encourage you to come to that event, and you can pick up a flyer somewhere in the room, perhaps by the door, of all of the year's events that we have planned. I hope that you'll stick around and look at the posters that have been contributed to the event and learn about some of the other activities going on around campus related to gender and agriculture, nutrition, and development. And then, of course, enjoy the reception and the opportunity to carry on this discussion. So please join me in giving a grand round of applause to our panelists.